In the mid-20th century, as the technology became more advanced and widespread, computers became powerful and flexible enough to serve a variety of scientific and business functions. However, since the earliest computers were ridiculously expensive, enormous, and consumed massive amounts of power, their use was usually restricted to serious business or scientific use. Thus, early video game development was based around experimentation with human-computer interaction, adaptive learning, or military strategy. Many of these types of video games were developed in Europe, including a computer called the Nimrod, which could play the mathematical game Nim, and several computers that could play tic-tac-toe. The United States saw its first computer game in the midst of the Cold War, with development of Hutzspiel in 1955. Built by the US military, it was meant to simulate a conflict between the United States and Soviet Union, with one person playing as the NATO commander and the other the USSR theater commander. 1956 saw the development of an IBM checkers program that was actually capable of self-improvement, and 1958 saw the development of the NSS chess program, the first chess program capable of defeating a novice human opponent. Also in 1958 was the development of Tennis for Two, a tennis game created by physicist William Higginbotham to entertain guests at the annual Visitors' Day held by the Brookhaven National Laboratory in New York. The game was displayed on an oscilloscope and allowed two players to volley a ball using knobs. It proved popular with the public, but was ultimately dismantled for parts. By 1962, Steve Russell, a computer scientist, and his friends had been spending their time creating simple programs for the new TX0 computer. With the release of the even newer PDP-1 computer, Russell decided to exploit the new hardware by creating a game in which two human-controlled spaceships tried to destroy each other by firing missiles. Dubbed Space War, Russell's program was one of the first video games to see national distribution when the Digital Equipment Corporation, maker of the PDP-1, decided to include it as a test program on every computer they sold. Nearly a decade later, in 1971, electrical engineer Nolan Bushnell, upon being exposed to Space War, immediately began looking into creating a coin-operated version of the game on an inexpensive television screen using its cathode ray tubes. Eventually, Bushnell created the game Computer Space, almost identical to Space War. However, the game ultimately failed thanks to an overly complicated physics system and complex controls that were difficult to understand. In the same year, another takeoff of Space War known as Galaxy Game was developed, but failed because it was created on a PDP-11 computer, resulting in a product that was too expensive for mass production.
This is Odyssey, the new electronic game simulator.
In 1972, the Magnavox Odyssey was released. For the retail price of about $100, the public can now experience video games in their very own homes. The Odyssey could be plugged into a television and displayed only white boxes. Owners had to place translucent plastic overlays to have even a remotely enjoyable experience. Nevertheless, the Odyssey ushered in a new era of home video game consoles that would last until now. Later that same year, Computer Space creator Nolan Bushnell went on to found Atari and released his next game for arcades, Pong, which saw widespread success with over 19,000 machines sold. 1977 saw the release of Atari's own home video game console, the Atari 2600. This console, along with Mattel's Intellivision, released in 1980, and the ColecoVision, released in 1982, would dominate the home video game market until 1983. The arcade game industry entered its golden age in 1978 with the release of Space Invaders, a hugely successful game that in just 4 years generated a revenue of $2 billion in quarters. This success inspired dozens of manufacturers to enter the market. Soon, arcade machines became prevalent in mainstream locations such as shopping malls, restaurants, and convenience stores. The release of games such as Galaxian, Asteroids, and Pac-Man helped to further the success of the industry. During the golden age of arcade games, video game arcades sprung up across the world. By 1982, there were 13,000 arcades in North America alone. All over America, children and even adults would flock to these arcades to spend quarter after quarter playing their favorite games. The arcade game industry reached its peak in 1982, generating $8 billion in quarters, surpassing both pop music and Hollywood films combined at that time. The early 80s also saw the increasing popularity of computers, including the Commodore 64, the most popular computer of its time. With these new computers, some advertised as gaming computers and others being used to emulate popular arcade games, attention was taken away from both the arcade and home video game industries. Finally, in 1983, the American market for video games crashed. This was caused mainly by the flood of new home consoles being released every year. Other causes included the fierce competition from home computers and the publishing of extremely mediocre titles that damaged the publishers' reputations. most famously, the video game version of E.T. for the Atari 2600, which was regarded as one of the worst games of all time. Thousands of unsold copies of the game were crushed and buried in New Mexico.
Will you be the one to witness the birth of the incredible Nintendo Entertainment System?
The American video game console market lay dormant until 1985 with the release of the Nintendo Entertainment System, which instantly became a success and almost single-handedly revived the market with its vibrant and realistic graphics.
Whoa, nice graphics! I'd like to get my hands on that game.
The release of the Nintendo Entertainment System, or NES for short, also marked the introduction of some of the most well-known video game franchises of all time, including Super Mario Bros., The Legend of Zelda, Final Fantasy, and Metal Gear. With the release of the NES, the production of home video game consoles and software shifted largely from the United States to Japan. However, some consoles and software was and still is being developed in America, most notably Microsoft's Xbox consoles. The popularity of arcade games decreased drastically after the crash of 1983, then saw a resurgence in the 90s with the release of games like Street Fighter, but ultimately disappeared when home consoles became increasingly popular and advanced. Many arcades were closed down, but others remained, dedicated to games that would be too expensive for the general public to have at home, such as Dance Dance Revolution. Since the revival of the market in 1985, the video game industry has seen many improvements and innovations, including the transition to 3D graphics, handheld gaming systems, motion controls, HD graphics, games with stereoscopic 3D, and even video games on telephones. For over 40 years, video games have proven to be popular in the United States, a trend that is likely to continue for even longer.
It's the Legend of Zelda and it's really rad. Those creatures from Ganon are pretty bad. Octoroks, Tektites, Levers too. But with your help, our hero pulls through. Yeah, go Link, yeah, get Zelda.
Awesome!